Well, this is All Out Politics live from the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. Let's get the view now from the opinion pages of the newspapers. And in the Times, former Cameron speechwriter Claire Foges says the Conservatives may win the next election, but Boris Johnson's scorched earth policy could mean they lose their soul. In The Guardian, the former Conservative Minister Justine Greening, who we've just been talking to, says Boris Johnson's Brexit homework is late and he needs to hand it in or admit he hasn't done it. And of course, she was calling there for the government to publish its Brexit negotiation positions. In Blower's cartoon in The Telegraph, Boris Johnson is enjoying his time in Manchester, hoping a Brexit Halloween party in the Rovers return. Salford, of course, the home of Coronation Street. Stephen Glover in the Daily Mail urges Boris Johnson to come clean about his dealings with the businesswoman Jennifer Arcuri, suggesting that fair-minded people would forgive him if it was just a, quote, dalliance. The Prime Minister declares himself to be a model of restraint in Morland's cartoon in The Times, although his trousers appear to be falling down and his girlfriend doesn't look too pleased with him. Trevor Kavanagh in The Sun says Boris Johnson may be bruised and battered, but he's still on top. In the Daily Telegraph, Theresa May's former Chief of Staff, Nick Timothy, claims the United Kingdom's politics are following the path of America's vicious culture wars, and the battle lines around class, education and geography will be here to stay, he says. But in The Guardian, a note of optimism from John Harris. He says politics may feel apocalyptic, but in his view, radical ideas from the left are at last emerging. Well, joining me today to look through all those are the political journalist Isabel Oakeshott and the chief leader writer of the Observer newspaper, Sonia Sodha. Welcome to you both. Any of you had any Me Too trouble with Boris Johnson?
Feel a bit left out, no. Everyone else seems to have.
Now, what do you think about this suggestion from Stephen Glover that, you know, Boris Johnson has a fairly racy reputation? If he just said, yeah, you know, it was me, sorry, so what? That would all go away. I
think the difficulty with that is where the potential abuse of public money and the awarding of contracts come in. I think you're right, or anyone who observes that Boris Johnson has a racy past and this is all factored in, I think that's absolutely the case, and no one will be surprised if over the next few days and weeks there are more allegations about dalliances, as you put them.
Not me, Stephen Glover.
But why the story about this particular one seems to have got more legs to it is because of this potential abuse of his position.
Yeah, and I think he's now facing this official investigation. He's been referred by a City Hall official. I think Downing Street's response to that, trying to claim it was politically motivated, show how worried they are about some of the kind of financial, some of the allegations of lack of probity around finances around this. So I think, it just adds to this sense that he is a sort of a prime minister under siege. He's he's embattled. I think it's interesting though. I sort of agree with Isabel and Stephen Glover that some of this stuff about Boris Johnson is kind of, as it were, priced in by voters. So they've kind of known for a while
he's
about
going through
his
a divorce and he's here openly with another woman in his hostess.
I do wonder that, I think there's a sense of sort of cumulative sort of perceptions that might grow around Boris Johnson. It's just, if Downing Street can't deal with these allegations and bat them away, I think it just contributes to a growing sense of a prime minister who really hasn't got it under control.
Now, I mean, this is into the second week, which, as we know, Alistair Campbell's Law and all the rest of it, 10 days, is never good for a story. What would be, and you've dealt with people as a journalist in these very tight situations, I mean, what would the advice be to Jennifer Arcuri, to Boris Johnson and indeed to Charlotte Edwards, the journalist who says that he squeezed her thigh 20 years ago, as far as going public, not going public,
right.
what they should admit to, what they shouldn't admit to.
Well, these parties all have different agendas, don't they? I mean,
yeah.
Charlotte Edwards has an agenda to make a splash. She's a journalist. I make no criticism of her for that, and I think it was perfectly reasonable. She's probably been sitting on this story for however many years it was, 20 years. She's chosen her moment to come out with it, and personally,
she's not talked on camera yet.
Personally, I see no reason why she would make that up. The timing is obviously unfortunate. I think the point is, the advice for Downing Street is to get your lines straight, because what you've got now is different cabinet ministers being accosted about this story as they move around the conference centre here and coming out with different lines. So we had Matt Hancock yesterday, who knows Charlotte Edwards and says he trusts her, which implies that he believes her. And then we've got other cabinet ministers saying, you know, the actual line from Downing Street is this is all nonsense. I do think it's problematic for Downing Street to hit back too hard on this, because the risk is you're going to get other women coming out and saying, actually, we believe Charlotte because it happened to us too. What
about Jennifer Arcuri? I mean, she's in America at the moment, but we haven't heard from her directly yet. Friends have said she was just giving him IT lessons. Others have said she was telling them she was having an affair with him. What should she do?
Well, I mean, if I was her, I'd keep my head down and kind of wouldn't say anything in public at all. But I think we'll have to wait and see. The official investigation might want to speak to her. I'm not sure what powers they have to sort of call her before them, or to like get, you know, make sure they get a response from her on what may have happened, what may have transpired. But I expect it's, you know, quite difficult for her being in the limelight in this way. So, but I do think. Even though sort of voters have sort of priced this stuff in about Boris Johnson, I think there may be some Conservative voters for whom it just adds to this kind of, you know, it's a bit distasteful, isn't it, for all these allegations to be coming out?
You know, I mean, Donald Trump is another example. Yeah. If you are known as being a bit of a card, I mean, seem to be some people who are fairly shameless, and it is part of their image, and people, you know, don't hold it against them. In fact, it seems to be an asset almost.
Well, that's certainly going to be Boris Johnson's approach to this, and it already is, to sort of try and emulate Donald Trump, to just try and let these allegations kind of wash off him. With some voters, that may work. I just think there will be some people in the Conservative Party who perhaps feel a bit uncomfortable about all of this.
Now, what about Claire Foge's article? Because this, yeah, I mean, it relates to what we've been talking about, but it's on the substance, and she's basically saying, yeah, okay, the coming strategy, scorched earth strategy, may win, but in the process, the Conservative Party is trashing the courts, trashing Parliament, trashing moral behaviour, and in the end, you know, maybe left with a rather sort of charred stump of a country and a party.
I think this is a really strong piece. I read it with a lot of interest, and her argument is essentially, look, you know, you're throwing everything out in your great quest and your mission to achieve Brexit. What is the legacy of that going to be in terms of setting precedents about whether it is or isn't okay to swap the law aside, to tear up conventions? How are we going to feel as Conservatives, she argues, when, you know, a few years down the line we may have a Jeremy Corbyn or John McDonnell administration, and they're tearing up the laws in order to appropriate property or whatever it is that might be their firebrand left-wing agenda? And I think these are reasonable points.
I think she puts her case very well. Where I think she was perhaps a little too optimistic was in her confidence that this is going to be a winning strategy for Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings. I think it could absolutely still prove to be a winning strategy, but I think it hangs a little bit more in the balance. It's absolutely true that Johnson is developing a very clear people versus the Parliament, very populist, I think very toxic message. But when you look at the electoral calculus on the ground, if he loses a chunk of seats in Scotland, in the southwest to the Lib Dems, that's an awful lot of seats he's got to win in the north and the Midlands. And Claire Foge's argument is he will absolutely achieve that with this narrative. I'm not so sure, because I think that in some areas of the country where you've got voters who've voted Labour for generations, it takes quite a lot, even if they're upset about Brexit, it takes quite a lot to switch away from Labour to a Conservative Party, which, you know, generations of their family may have abhorred.
OK, thank you both very much indeed. See you in the next hour. Well, here at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester, I nearly said Brighton there, we're waiting for the Prime Minister to come to the conference hall. We'll bring you pictures of that in just a moment. In the meantime, let's look at the view and the opinions expressed in today's newspapers. Former speechwriter for David Cameron, Claire Foges, writes in The Times. She says the Conservatives may win the next election, but Boris Johnson's scorched earth policy will have a long-term cost for the party's reputation. In The Guardian, the former Conservative Minister Justine Greening says Mr Johnson's Brexit homework is late and he needs to hand it in or admit he hasn't done it. Blower's cartoon in The Telegraph has Boris Johnson enjoying his time in Manchester, hosting a Brexit Halloween party at the Rovers' return, which of course this is where the Rovers' return is. Stephen Glover in the Daily Mail urges Mr Johnson to come clean about his dealings with the businesswoman Jennifer Arcuri, suggesting that a fair-minded people would forgive him if it was just a dalliance. The Prime Minister declares himself to be a model of restraint in Morland's cartoon in The Times, although his trousers are falling down. Trevor Kavanagh in The Sun says Boris Johnson may be bruised and battered, but he is still on top. And in the Daily Telegraph, Theresa May's former Joint Chief of Staff, Nick Timothy, claims that UK politics is following the path of America's vicious culture wars, and the battle lines around class, education and geography are here to stay. Different vision in The Guardian, if you like. John Harris says politics may feel a bit apocalyptic at the moment, but he believes radical ideas from the left are at last emerging. Well, joining me today to look through those are the political journalist Isabel Oakeshott and the chief leader writer for The Observer, Sonia Sodha. Welcome to you both. Now, we've got these two interesting, I thought, pieces, both by Nick Timothy, who used to be special advisor to Chief of Staff, indeed, for Theresa May, and also John Harris, who likes to look at politics away from Westminster. John Harris saying the left may be actually coming up with solutions that appeal to people, and Nick Timothy basically saying we're going to American-style battle lines, culture wars. Who do you... I mean, I suppose the two are consistent, possibly.
They're possibly consistent, but I find much more to agree with in John Harris's piece. So I think he's looked at what's emerged out of Labour's conference last week. It was quite a radical kind of basket of policies in some ways. I think it was a mixed bag. There was some really good stuff that we at The Observer have been calling for a really long time, like free social care for the over 65s. We face a massive care crisis in this country, and there just isn't enough funding there. And it seems weird that if you've got dementia, you don't qualify for free care in the same way that if you've got cancer. So really great policy from Labour there. On schools, we saw some pretty radical stuff on private schools. We saw John McDonnell talk about a 4-day week. So I think he's right that there are some very interesting ideas emerging on the left. I think they're a mixed bag electorally in terms of how they'll play with voters. And I think Labour's issue is that it really wants to move off Brexit very quickly and make the election about other things, about some of these radical policies.
Sounds a bit familiar to the Conservatives here.
Exactly, but I think the next election will be dominated by Brexit. So I think the challenge for the country is there's all these other things we should be talking about. I think whatever happens with Brexit, whether we crash out, whether we get some sort of deal, whether we have a referendum and we vote to remain, we are going to be talking about Brexit for the next 5 to 10 years in this country. It's going to dominate our politics. There's no such thing as getting Brexit done and it all being over. There will still be lots to talk about, lots for our politicians to argue over. So I do think that it's going to be quite tricky to get off Brexit onto some of these domestic politics.
I suppose the question is whether Brexit can be confined, or whether the process of going for Brexit and the way that it seems to have polarised people means that we sort of tip accidentally into a culture war, if you like.
Yes, I mean, I think there is a real sense of polarisation, the like of which I've not observed before in 15 plus years of reporting on politics. And, part of this is Brexit, and part of it is the radicalisation on the left. You know, the policies that Sonia referred to, not all of them are particularly polarising. I think many, if not most Conservatives could agree with those policies that you outlined there on social care, and particularly in relation to dementia. But when you're talking about shutting down private schools and appropriating property and land and ludicrous wealth taxes, then you really are dividing people. And in fact, the polling for Labour is very, very weak at the moment. One of the few crumbs of comfort that there are for the Conservatives here as they gather, and there really is no obvious solution in sight to the Brexit dilemma.
I mean, there does seem to be a kind of, well, if they're moving to the right, it's time we should move to the left because we've got opportunity, that politics is becoming polarised. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we have seen the Conservative Party move really quite substantially to the right. I think, yeah, of course we've seen the Labour Party move to the left as well, and it does feel like that centre ground of politics doesn't exist in quite the same way anymore. I think that's partly because there's a sort of consensus that the economic settlement that we had, in the 1990s, 2000s, led to the financial crisis, and it maybe wasn't quite working anymore. So that's why I think you've seen a radicalisation on the left. I do think, though, that our politics is actually more polarised than voters are feeling in the country at large. So I think if you look at the scenes in Parliament on Wednesday, it's easy to look at them and just feel that our politics has become so toxic. But I really think that actually if you were to ask voters have actually got more in common than I think sometimes you see on both sides of the House of Commons. So I'm wary about Nick Timothy's argument that we're not descending into an American-style culture war yet. We don't have the same issues like guns or abortion that really split the nation here. So I think we should be wary about sensationalising this.
Yeah, you've got a Conservative Party here arguably moving on to, left of centre ground, talking about spending taxpayers' money on health, on education, on the police.
I don't really recognise or accept your premise that the Conservative Party has lurched to the right, and I'm interested why you think that. Is it simply because you see the Conservative Party leadership potentially embracing, as a necessary ill in their view, a clean break Brexit? Because otherwise I don't see a raft of Tory policies that are necessarily very hard right of centre. And in terms of polarisation, I actually disagree with you that Parliament last week, with all its toxicity, is not reflective of the mood in the country. I think it'll get a whole lot worse. If there is a plot whereby a kind of coalition of Remain in Parliament become a caretaker government, I think you haven't seen anything like what is going to come in terms of the anger in this country when there seems to be an illegitimate administration.
I just don't think that's the case, actually, and I think that's exactly what Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings are seeking to warn people of, because they're saying they're looking at the idea of a caretaker government. It's not an outcome that they want, and they are trying to whip up public fear about that, I think. But on this point about the Conservative Party moving to the right, the reason I think that is because of this embrace. I think Boris Johnson is gunning for a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October. There's no way he can get a deal through before then. If he's saying he's going to leave, do or die, it means a no-deal Brexit. And to see a Conservative Party, the two great principles of a Conservative Party were the union and protecting the union and, economic stewardship. And a no-deal Brexit, all the economic forecasts say, would be dreadful for the country's economy in the medium term in terms of the cost of jobs and growth, and it poses a real risk to the union as well. I think Scotland could vote to go independent if we were to crash out of the European Union.
There are those who would say what you're talking about civil unrest and real anger amongst people. Some would say that's an alt-right tactic of threatening civil disturbance if we don't get our way.
Well, I don't know who's threatening it, and of course people should not be threatening it. It wouldn't be the right response. But I've been...
Oh, here he is, just seeing pictures of Mr. Johnson.
Look with the women, Prime Minister!
Wearing a red tie.
Well, that was all.
Don't often see that. I don't know where he's going. Presumably to a photo opportunity. He certainly won't be driving to the conference centre because it's only about 40 yards. Boris Johnson there, first pictures of the Prime Minister today. Now,
So my point was, I was going to say, I wonder how many places you've been to up north, in Wales and so on, where there's a strong Leave vote. please, I'm telling you, the anger there is incredible. You know, these are powder kegs, and if we have an illegitimate administration that takes over and seeks to overturn the result of the referendum, I think we will be in much more dangerous territory than
the thing is,
it's
just not an illegitimate administration, though. We live in a parliamentary representative
but do you think there
democracy.
is that anger out there?
I think there is some anger, absolutely, but I also think that people go out and look for the anger. When journalists do, you know, vox pops, you're asking people how they think. I think most people do not think about Brexit day in, day out, 24/7. I think it's likely to be a small slice of voters on either side who feel incredibly strongly about it, and I think there's a big chunk of people in the middle who, who just want the issue to be over with.
Okay, thank you both very much indeed.